Elden Ring bosses have a rather unfair image thrust upon them of janky, flaily, delayed attack street and messes that have taken a significant departure from previous combat design philosophies in Souls games. Of course, claiming nothing's changed whatsoever would be absurd. Setting aside the different animations, the way their AI is built is pretty different from something like Dark Souls 3 for example, and yet Dark Souls 3 is a massive departure from Dark Souls 2, and so on and so forth. Indeed, claiming nothing's changed would be disingenuous, but claiming that said changes are not the core iterative developmental progression in these games would be equally astonishing. In recent years, I've spent a sizable chunk of my time dissecting these bosses and trying to find workarounds for their many quirks, as challenge runners have always done. Having said that, these are my top 5 picks for what I consider to be the most enjoyable combat designs in the game, with some minor additions in between so as to explain some beloved boss's omission. Number 5 is going to be none other than our beloved first real challenge of Elden Ring, Margit. As an introductory boss, I find him fascinating enough to land him in the top 5 of the game. It's interesting when FromSoft designs the very first boss to be on par with many pretty hard encounters from their previous titles. I think this complexity is twofold, in that a vast majority of people will be incentivized to bypass it using the game's RPG systems. Obviously, nothing wrong with that, but it does bear to question why over-design a boss like this. Personally, I think Margit embodies as many design concepts as possible from throughout the game. Adopting this throw as much at the wall to see what sticks philosophy means there is no way any player will leave the fight without having learned at least something relevant to how the game works, whether it be spirit ashes, strafing attacks, punishing delayed wind-ups, or the existence of conditional follow-ups. Margit has it all. His combos get interrupted if you step behind him, much like most humanoid bosses in the game. His gap closers meant to punish running away. Staying in front of him for certain attacks will trigger nigh unreactable dagger swipes at times that you have to play around by properly understanding combo chains and trigger ranges. Not to mention the first instance of what I like to call double swipe attacks. Two attacks that happen in such quick succession that dodging both without careful positioning is impossible. His double light sword swings, if you're in front of him, can only be dodged by rolling diagonally to his side, so that you have enough time to queue up a second roll, which has to be aimed at his tail. In doing this, the third part of the attack, the ground thrust, will be blind spotted. His quick uppercut serves as an introduction to Elden Ring's hard-to-react attacks that so many people despise. This move also doubles down as a zoning tool if you're trying to fight him without rolling, as it can happen each time he side hops if you are too slow to follow him. This is the first relevant encounter where jumps serve a real purpose. His tail swipe and his main melee gap closer are both jumpable, and in doing so you gain significant advantages to positioning and aggression. Pair all this with the coolest shit boss that actively trash talks you, and you've got an extremely hyped first encounter with a rather peculiar character. Him being viable for both no sprint and no roll, I think adds quite a bit in the enjoyability department, as the more avenues you have to engage with the boss, the better, in my opinion. For our first honorable mention, we're gonna take a look at Malekith. Malekith is a pretty complex boss that largely seems to function as a glass cannon for most casual runs of the game. High damage, low HP, low poise type of deal. The two phases, while they might seem disjointed, have quite a few parallels between them in terms of animations. Phase 1 is extremely agile and nimble, while Phase 2 is more sluggish and requires more positional awareness. Malekith tests the player's ability to punish wind-ups rather than recoveries, and for that fact alone, many people find him a challenge. He also has a tendency to jump around, though said tendency is rather restricted by the AI. His Destined Death Flurry acts as a huge area of effect denial ability that you have to learn to play around. Luckily, it is on a hard cooldown of 15 seconds. There is a common misconception that it only acts as a follow-up to certain attacks. That is wrong, though it is very likely to come out as a follow-up, and as such players rarely see it from neutral. At this point in the game, Malekith's low poise, HP pool, and in my opinion more rudimentary combat skill checks make him a miss the top 5, while still being an incredibly fun boss nonetheless. For our number 4 spot we have Radahn. Radahn is a pretty interesting encounter in the game. Some would say that his delayed attacks are representative of the worst Elden Ring has to offer. His arrow phase is nothing more than filler runback on repeat playthroughs. A model this large is bound to be plagued by camera issues, right? And yet I find Radahn to be a very consistently chill fight. There is nothing immediately threatening in his moveset, nothing that makes you be on edge non-stop waiting for the ultimate move. The pace of the encounter is quite steady, nothing is particularly off-kilter. For this reason, Radahn tends to be very easy to fight for longer periods of time. His drift attack is often used as evidence as to why some delayed attacks in Elden Ring simply don't work. And yes, it does have some issues. In being so ridiculously delayed on the wind-up, yet so unreactably quick on the swing, the only option the player has of learning it is to memorize the wind-up length and roll before the swing happens, which on an attack this long is rather egregious. His double sword slam is very quick, but once you get the hang of it, it shouldn't pose as big of a problem. Indeed, the interesting part of the fight is how his phase 2 works. Most of his special phase 2 attacks' cooldowns are nested within each other, meaning a lot of them will happen in quick succession. As memorable as the meteor is, it really only serves as a huge time waster on repeat playthroughs, as it is abysmally easy to dodge. As long as you know he will always spawn where your character is looking, and you start moving backwards as soon as he spawns in the sky, you don't even have to sprint to outspace it. Luckily, this attack can only happen again after he reaches 20% HP, so it's not as egregious as Rykard's Skull Storm, for example. His corkscrew attack's hitboxes are so tiny you can strafe it simply by running straight into him as he's floating up. The only part of his model that even has hitboxes during that attack is his swords. The meteors hovering around him are completely strafable nowadays, simply by running sideways while being moderately at a distance. A common misconception is that Radahn's nerfs significantly neutered him. As someone that has done RL1 NG+7 kills on Radahn both pre and post patch, I can confidently say nothing whatsoever was changed to how people usually fight him optimally. Smaller hitbox cylinders on the swords don't matter if you're never nowhere near them. I'm gonna link my pre-patch Radahn kill in the description as proof. The only significant change is the meteors becoming strafable, as their tracking was much higher pre-patch. Nonetheless, they were never threatening even then. Mohg is going to be our number 3 pick. I used to have a honeymoon phase with Mohg. He was definitely my favorite fight in the game for quite a few months after launch. In spite of his rather simplistic moveset, a huge part of his complexity comes from how you deal with the blood flame patterns in phase 2. There are specific follow-ups you can consistently bait so as to prevent him from disengaging from you, therefore making it reliable to avoid the blood flame entirely. His two largest defining issues are his blood flame shower and his arena. Many Elden Ring bosses have what I like to call get off me moves, attacks they can perform if your aggression is high. Indeed, seeing them is a sign that you're doing the right thing. Then, why do they exist? Diegetically, it makes sense for someone to try and create distance when they're losing, so I assume that was the main inspiration for this. Nonetheless, this move very often breaks the pace of the fight. In phase 1, he can very commonly go into idle after performing his blood shower, effectively forcing you to lose the stagger build-up on him, unless you use ranged options. In phase 2, forcing you to get off him means you will have to re-engage him through his garden of blood flame. This is very dangerous, especially if you are backed against the wall. For that reason alone, you should always be mindful not just of your positioning relative to the boss, of the blood flame trails off screen and in duration, but also of your arena relative position to the best of your ability. This segues into the other big problem Mohg has. His arena is pretty dogshit. Stairs have always been a well-documented phenomenon plaguing Souls AI. Whether they interrupted combo chains, made certain strafes unreliable, forced enemies into their falling animation after an attack, or even masking arena hazards, stairs have never worked well with FromSoft bosses, and Mohg is no exception. His blood flame will be frequently hidden inside the stairs, spread unevenly, sometimes reaching distances it should never reach. His delayed claw into swing combo is now unreliable to strafe. His flying attacks can't get animation cancelled or have their reach modified. Ultimately, you should never try to fight Mohg on the stairs in his arena if you value not getting hit or even just consistency. Nonetheless, I find the deceptive simplicity behind this fight to be very appealing. You have a boss that at first doesn't seem to ask much of the player, maybe even seeming unfair, becoming a very mechanically engaging encounter that can be consistently controlled. For our second honorable mention, we have Horalu, although all that I'm going to show here is this. Moving on, our number 2 spot is going to be Morgott. Yeah, I don't have much to say about him. This is Margit on crack. This is the epitome of solo FromSoft boss design. He might have a bit too little HP, which creates the same problem as with Margit, where most people will simply bypass the many mechanics of the fight simply by out-RPGing him, but that changes nothing as to the quality of the moveset and its interactability. Morgott will jump away if you get behind him, dagger swipe you if you are in front of him at the wrong time. A lot of his combo chains can both be interrupted or drawn out for oftentimes equally worthwhile results, as long as you know when and how. He has so many punish windows without ever feeling like he's not aggressive enough. He loses the frustrating double light sword swings that Margit had in favor of an equally annoying spear charge attack. This spear charge might be the most difficult thing to dodge in the fight, to be honest. Then there is his wacky flaily attack, which, while being a bit of a time waster, is by no means unpunishable. Overall, Morgott is a sight to behold, and fighting him would be the best thing ever, if it weren't for our next entry on this list. And this is it, my all-time favorite FromSoft fight, my all-time favorite FromSoft enemies, what is, in my opinion, the most complex encounter ever designed by From Software, Godskin Duo. They get a lot of ire, and this specific entry is more or less going to try and focus on the criticisms often levied at the boss. Many people complain about the individual Godskins reviving each other, not realizing that if they didn't, this fight would be an actual gang fight for much longer. If you spread the 24k HP they share in base NG between just two entities, you're now facing two quite tanky enemies that you won't be able to burst down, thus incentivizing people to play rather passively. Instead, players want to play aggressively to take one out as soon as possible. They don't have complementary movesets. Noble is much faster and has longer reach, while Apostle has barely any reach whatsoever and is struggling to keep up with Noble. They are full-fledged bosses matched together and are too complex to form a gang fight. Their AI is specifically designed to stay in passive mode unless aggroed, which heavily restricts their individual movesets. On screen is the restricted Apostle moveset when unaggroed. Focusing on Noble will prevent Apostle from doing any other attacks than these. Pillars don't work, they in fact do. It is annoying that not all faces are consistent, but once one face is observed to be working, it will always be working. Furthermore, the two middle pillars are exceedingly safe. The right middle pillar, if you're facing the altar, is 100% safe, while the left one is functionally consistent. In many hundreds of hours, I've only seen Noble roll over it twice, and both times it was over the exact same side of the pillar. Noble presence is perfectly reactable, as proven time and time again, as long as you dedicate some time to practicing it. You can stagger either of the Godskins from their summon animation to completely prevent it from happening again on that one Godskin. Apostle is strongly incentivized not to aggress during Noble's rolling attack, but if he does, dealing with a stray fireball while Noble is rolling is no big deal as long as you recognize it in time and don't get stuck on a pillar. Apostle is very likely the best no-sprint boss ever designed by From Software, while Noble works phenomenally with rolls. In fighting them, you are forced to adjust your playstyle to their two different designs and punish them as efficiently as possible. Godskin Duo is, in my opinion, the most fun I've ever had fighting any From Software boss to date. I have many hundreds of hours spread between both the Godskins in their various iterations throughout the game, as well as the duo, and I love it to no end.